In the Greek edition of Matthew, many of the quotes come from the Septuagint, or more accurately, the Old Greek, but Septuagint is shorter to type. This fact is often used by Greek primicists to say that Matthew must have been written in Greek originally. The reasoning goes that a Hebrew edition of Matthew would not have back-translated Old Testament quotes. There's a number of problems with this thought process. First, we know that the Septuagint was based on a slightly different Hebrew-based text than the Masoretic text. Part of the evidence that supports this is a number of fragments discovered at Qumran that are written in Hebrew but support the Septuagint reading. Even if the SDM family is not the original and the original Hebrew Matthew did have quotes more in line with the Septuagint, Hebrew Matthew could quote from those Proto-Septuagint sources. Or Hebrew Matthew could backtranslate, since we know that the other Gospel writers were also perfectly capable of providing fresh translation of the Proto-Masoretic text when the Septuagint didn't suit their purposes. All of that leaves to one side the most obvious solution. Hebrew Matthew could simply have used the Proto-Masoretic text, and the Greek Matthew translator could have used the Septuagint that he was familiar with instead of creating a fresh translation. However, I took a bit of time and effort to examine the Old Testament quotes against the Hebrew Matthew of the Paris manuscript, their parallels in the other Gospels, the Greek edition of Matthew, and the Septuagint. My discovery was that neither the SDM family nor the Greek text generally prefer reading in line with the Septuagint against a reading in line with the Hebrew of the Masoretic text. It's clear that the translator knew the Septuagint, and used those quotes unmodified when they agree in substance with the Hebrew text. In most cases where there is a difference in substance, Matthew in the Greek modifies the Septuagint quote to match the Hebrew. But I don't expect anyone to just take my word for it, so I'm including all the quotes I examined and their relevant parallels below. Since the general trend of using Septuagint quotes, and not any one particular case, is used to suggest that Matthew was written in Greek, I'm going to go through each and every Old Testament quote when it is directly mentioned as a quote and the quote can be identified. There are a number of allusions to the Old Testament. To my eye, it seems that there are more in the Hebrew, the few clearest of which I've already commented on. But the opponent is going to say that these don't count because I'm simply noting places where similar language is used to draw a point, and that connection might be hyperpattern recognition on my part. The same could be said for cases where the connection is seen in Greek as well. So I'll limit myself to only those places where the author or a speaker directly indicates that something is written. In each case, I will include the text of Matthew in Hebrew, in Greek, and all potential sources of the quote from the Septuagint and the digital Westminster Leningrad Codex, and parallel passages in Mark or Luke. To summarize briefly, the evidence seems to me to suggest that Matthew originally followed the Hebrew and not the Septuagint. Even the Greek edition of Matthew, when it uses the Septuagint, most often corrects it to be closer to the Hebrew text when the Hebrew and the Septuagint diverge. There are only two examples where Greek Matthew follows the Septuagint against either the Hebrew or the other synoptics, so I'll list those first. Then there are two cases where the way the Hebrew handles the quote suggests dependence on Hebrew sources, or the text originally being as we have it in the Hebrew edition. I'll list those next. Then there are 17 cases that Matthew does not follow the Septuagint. These don't directly relate to the question of whether Matthew was written in Hebrew or Greek. On the other hand, since the idea that Matthew used the Septuagint is used as evidence against the idea that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, this data does run directly counter to that idea, and the one seeking to support the Septuagint as a source will need to address these. For completeness, I include the remaining 19 Old Testament quotes even though they are completely neutral. The text in these is not different enough between the Hebrew and the Septuagint to demonstrate that Matthew in either Hebrew or Greek really prefers the meaning of one over the other. Matthew chapter 4 verse 7 favors Greek. This one might actually favor the Septuagint. The you here is singular in both versions of Matthew, in Luke, and in the Septuagint. The Hebrew of Deuteronomy has you in plural. This could be an example of following the Septuagint. On the other hand, since Jesus is only talking about himself and not a bunch of people, it's a change that makes sense. Matthew chapter 15 verses 8 and 9 favors Greek. The first part of these verses is a rare case where the Greek edition of Matthew follows the Septuagint more closely than Mark. In the second half, Matthew's translator into Greek once again follows Mark in a way that the Septuagint does not. Jesus quotes this passage after he said, "Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition?" in verse 3. In Greek, this statement in verse 6 is,
Διότι και εμείς παραβαίνετε την εντολή του Θεού δια την παράδοσιν ημών.
in Hebrew it's,
ולמה אתם עוברים את מצות האלוהים בשביל גזירתכם?
in Greek, Jesus's
Δολ,
connects to,
εντάλματα.
from Isaiah. In Hebrew, Jesus's
מצות,
connects to Isaiah's,
מצוות,
Εντολήν.
and
מצוות.
are not exactly the same. The same connection is made in both Hebrew and Greek. I leave it to those who are more proficient than I am in both languages to make this decision, but it looks smoother to me in Greek. I suspect that this was originally spoken in Greek. Matthew chapter 2 verse 23 favors Hebrew. This quotation is unique. In both Hebrew and Greek it says, "For he will be called a Nazarene." But there's no Old Testament verse that says this. The Hebrew word
נצר,
is obviously very similar to.
נצרת,
This word occurs 4 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 14 verse 9 has,
כנצר נתעב,
which seems to me the closest phonetically. This is still pretty far off. Another similar Hebrew word is,
נצר,
it means protect. This word only occurs 63 times in the Hebrew Old Testament. None of them seem to correspond to Matthew's statement. Several scenarios suggest themselves in Hebrew. Matthew may simply be employing the wordplay to draw attention to the 4 cases that
נצר,
is used. All 4 of them seem to me to have fairly obvious messianic applications, but exploring that in more detail is beyond the scope of this already way too long post. Matthew may be drawing to the meaning of protector. No prophet ever specifically called the Messiah that, but it kinda makes sense. It could be that Matthew is drawing attention specifically to the idea of Jesus being the branch of Jesse in Isaiah chapter 11 verse 1. Figuring out which of these make the most sense is beyond the scope of this post. But it is worth noting that no solutions present themselves in Greek with the canon as it stands. Matthew chapter 21 verse 13 favors Hebrew. The Greek follows the Septuagint. Let's just get that out of the way. The Isaiah quote is pretty straightforward either way without enough difference between them to make a decision. Jeremiah is a little different. The Jeremiah quote is in Aramaic, not Hebrew. Translations made in the Middle Ages quote this text in Hebrew. It seems more likely to me that the Aramaic quote would come from the 1st century, quoting the verse as it was commonly said rather than how it was written. Matthew chapter 4 verse 6 against Septuagint. I have put brackets around the part that's taken out of the quote in the Septuagint version of the psalm. Greek Matthew and Luke skip different amounts of the psalm, with Luke leaving in, "He will protect you," out of, "He will protect you in all your ways." This section isn't in the Hebrew. This means that the Greek corresponds more to the Hebrew than the Greek, although the Greek translator clearly was familiar with either the Septuagint or Luke, or both. Why Luke abbreviated the Septuagint even though he was clearly quoting from it is a conversation for someone else to have at some other time and some other place. This is one of the reasons that I don't think Matthew's translator from Hebrew to Greek had Luke in front of him, but had heard it or read it. You can feel Luke's influence as much as the Septuagint influence, but the translator definitely tries to follow the Hebrew text as well. Matthew chapter 26 verse 31 against Septuagint. The Hebrew text follows the wording of Zechariah very closely. In contrast, the Greek text provides an entirely fresh translation from the Hebrew instead of using the Septuagint. This means that the idea of Matthew following the Septuagint is not supported by this verse. Interestingly, the Greek translator also did not follow Mark. Mark did follow the Septuagint. Matthew chapter 2 verse 15 against Septuagint. The Hebrew text is essentially the same. The only difference is a conjunction. The Greek is a fresh translation from the Hebrew. Matthew in both the Hebrew and Greek has my son, where the Septuagint has his child. While this does not specifically support the idea that Matthew was written in Hebrew, it very much works against the idea that Matthew was quoting from the Septuagint and not the Proto-Masoretic text. Matthew chapter 22 verse 37 against Septuagint. The Hebrew quotes Deuteronomy exactly. The Greek quotes the Septuagint nearly, but not exactly. I don't see that the changes help the theology. At the very least, this takes a little wind out of the sails of those that say that quoting from the Septuagint suggests that Matthew should have been written in Greek first. Matthew chapter 15 verse 4 against Septuagint. In this case, it is clear that the Greek translator of Matthew follows Mark, not the Septuagint. The Septuagint is actually closer to the Hebrew, which is identical between the Hebrew Matthew and Exodus. But as is so often the case, the Greek translator followed Mark. Matthew chapter 4 verse 4 against Septuagint. Hebrew Matthew follows Deuteronomy very closely, but Greek Matthew threads the difference between Deuteronomy and Luke. Once again, the Septuagint follows the Hebrew closer than Matthew's translator from Hebrew to Greek. This is one of the reasons that I don't think Matthew's translator from Hebrew to Greek had Luke in front of him, but had heard it or read it. You can feel Luke's influence more than the Septuagint influence, but the translator definitely tries to follow the Hebrew text as well. Matthew chapter 2 verse 18 against Septuagint. The Hebrew of Matthew follows exactly. The Greek version of Matthew is definitely inspired by the Septuagint, but it is altered slightly to conform just a little more to the Hebrew text. Instead of, "She wouldn't stop crying," as in the Septuagint it reads, "She wouldn't be comforted," as in the Hebrew. Personally, I don't feel that this provides any evidence one way or the other, but those that say following the Septuagint suggests it was written in Greek would need to admit that this would be a case of following the Hebrew and therefore work against them. Matthew chapter 3 verse 3 against Septuagint. I'm including all the parallels, so let's just get John out of the way. John paraphrases the passage. I include it out of completeness. It adds nothing to the actual conversation. Moving on. Hebrew Matthew quotes the Hebrew text. If Greek Matthew had followed either the Septuagint or the Hebrew text, it would have been impossible to tell which from this quote. Even though this quote doesn't demonstrate which way the relationship goes, it is clear that either Greek Matthew copied Mark here or Mark copied Greek Matthew. This is a case of assimilation as discussed in another post. Matthew chapter 1 verse 23 against Septuagint. Notable here is that Greek Matthew adds the interpretation of the name Emmanuel that is not present in the Hebrew nor is it present in the Septuagint. The Greek of the Septuagint follows the Hebrew very closely here, so that the Hebrew Matthew follows the Masoretic text and the Greek Matthew follows the Septuagint doesn't tell us much. Matthew chapter 4 verses 15 and 16 against Septuagint. The Greek text and the Hebrew text of Matthew are both abbreviated slightly. However, the translator into Greek does make some changes to the Septuagint text when he imports it into Matthew in order to help conform it slightly better to the Hebrew text. Matthew chapter 8 verse 17 against Septuagint. This appears to be a completely fresh translation in the Greek edition of Matthew from the Hebrew. The Hebrew edition of Matthew follows Isaiah very closely. This is strange to me, because I actually think that the Septuagint conforms to Christian doctrine more closely. Matthew chapter 11 verse 10 against Septuagint. The Hebrew Matthew follows the Hebrew of Malachi. The Greek edition of Matthew follows Mark, which is clearly inspired by the Septuagint, but the translator adjusted to be closer to the Hebrew. Matthew chapter 12 verses 18 through 21 against Septuagint. Both the Greek and the Hebrew of Matthew follow the Hebrew of Isaiah. This certainly does not follow the Septuagint. While the evidential value for demonstrating that Matthew was written in Hebrew is low, this is another nail in the coffin of the theory that Matthew primarily used the Septuagint, and therefore severely hampers the line of reasoning that says Matthew would have written in Greek because he used the Septuagint. Matthew chapter 13 verses 14 and 15 against Septuagint. Both the Greek and the Hebrew of Matthew follow the Hebrew of Isaiah. This certainly does not follow the Septuagint. While the evidential value for demonstrating that Matthew was written in Hebrew is low, this is another nail in the coffin of the theory that Matthew primarily used the Septuagint, and therefore severely hampers the line of reasoning that says Matthew would have written in Greek because he used the Septuagint. Matthew chapter 13 verse 35 against Septuagint. You can definitely tell that the translator to Greek was aware of the Septuagint version. It's also clear that he didn't have it in front of him and translated the Hebrew directly. This severely hampers the line of reasoning that says Matthew would have written in Greek because he used the Septuagint. Matthew chapter 15 verse 4 against Septuagint. Mark clearly did copy straight out of the Septuagint. Matthew clearly didn't copy straight out of either Septuagint or Mark. This is why I don't think Matthew had a copy of Mark in hand when making his Gospel. The Greek of Mark and the Septuagint are technically closer to the Hebrew of both the Torah and the Hebrew Matthew. Translation is as much art as science, though, and the Greek translator of Matthew caught the sense of it just fine. While the evidential value for demonstrating that Matthew was written in Hebrew is low, this is another nail in the coffin of the theory that Matthew primarily used the Septuagint, and therefore severely hampers the line of reasoning that says Matthew would have written in Greek because he used the Septuagint. One point that is missed by what I skip over here is a slight difference between the Greek and Hebrew of Matthew. In the Hebrew of Matthew, the two quotes in chapter 15 verse 4 are separated by, "and it is written." In the Greek, they're just separated by, "and." This Greek abbreviation follows the parallel in Mark chapter 7 verse 10. This is clearly a case where the parallels between Matthew and Mark are less stark when Matthew is taken from Hebrew. Matthew chapter 19 verse 18 and 19 against Septuagint. I never noticed that the 10 Commandments are in a different order in the Septuagint until now. The order in Matthew is the order in the Hebrew, even in the Greek edition of Matthew. The only commandment worded differently in either Greek or Hebrew is to honor your father and mother. The Greek doesn't quote the Septuagint. The fact that these are in the Hebrew order suggests that it is drawing from the Hebrew edition. I also noticed that each of the Synoptic Gospels have a different list of commandments. I think Mark is closer to the Septuagint order, and Luke has one that aren't in the others. This works in favor of traditions even more traditional than mine. That Matthew didn't draw from Mark and Luke is mostly independent. One piece of evidence doesn't prove that case, though. Let's let the traditionalists have this one. Matthew chapter 2 verse 6 neutral. Neither is really all that close. Hebrew Matthew is closer to the Hebrew of Micah, but there are enough differences all around that this is more of a paraphrase than a quote. Matthew chapter 4 verse 10 neutral. Without going into detail, either the Greek nor the Hebrew are explicit quotes of the Old Testament. The sentiment is the same between both, and it's very much a sentiment of the Old Testament, but it isn't written just like this anywhere. Matthew chapter 21 verse 5 neutral. Both the Hebrew and the Greek are edited in very similar ways. I don't see enough difference here to really make note of which is more likely. Matthew chapter 21 verse 16 neutral. The Hebrew follows the Hebrew and the Greek follows the Septuagint, but there's not enough difference to make a decision about which is more likely to be original in any particular way. Matthew chapter 21 verse 42 neutral. The Hebrew follows the Hebrew and the Greek follows the Septuagint, but there's not enough difference to make a decision about which is more likely to be original in any particular way. Matthew chapter 22 verse 32 neutral. This is a paraphrase of several similar statements in Exodus. Neither the Hebrew nor the Greek exactly quotes any one verse. Matthew chapter 22 verse 39 neutral. The Hebrew follows the Hebrew and the Greek follows the Septuagint, but there's not enough difference to make a decision about which is more likely to be original in any particular way. Matthew chapter 22 verse 44 neutral. The Hebrew follows the Hebrew and the Greek follows the Septuagint, but there's not enough difference to make a decision about which is more likely to be original in any particular way. It's interesting that Mark has the most variants from the Septuagint here. Someone that wants to show whether Mark uses the Septuagint should do that study. Now I'm curious, but that's a study that would take enough time, and I'm busy enough that I'm not likely to get to it soon. Matthew chapter 27 verses 9 and 10 neutral. Neither the Hebrew nor the Greek is really a quote of this. It follows much more closely to the Hebrew than the Septuagint, but it's far enough to leave me uncomfortable setting it up to be evidence for either side. Matthew chapter 24 verse 15 so neutral I don't even count it. This one isn't even really worth listing, but I append it to the list for a sense of completeness. It's not even clear which verse is quoted. It's more an allusion to the idea. Conclusion. I think it's clear that the Greek translator knew about the Septuagint and even used it extensively. I think it's also clear that he was very much aware of Mark and Luke. However, when you lay out all the evidence for and against the Greek edition of Matthew favoring dependence on the Septuagint against the readings of the Paris manuscript, it's a lot harder to continue to believe this. This is not conclusive in itself that Matthew was written in Hebrew, but it does deflate a common argument against the idea.